Welcome everyone to part 2 of my 1950s Hostess gown sewing project. My bodice was constructed at this point as well as my skirt, but they were not attached to each other because I had to do a bias binding. I decided to make my own bias tape because I didn't really want it to be something as plain as regular cotton bias tape, and I wanted to use supplies from my stash anyway, so I pulled out some really pretty green cotton velveteen that I used to make my Christmas dress about 1.5 years ago, and decided to use that for both the bias binding and the cuffs and the facing for the collar. I felt like something with a sort of pile to it, like velvet or velveteen, would really elevate the house coat into something special, but I didn't want to go with a really high maintenance fabric, which is why I was quite happy with the cotton velveteen that I already had on hand. The construction of this dress is rather odd in that it has you bind the top edge of your skirt and line that edge up with your seam line on the bottom edge of your bodice, and then you top stitch that together. I personally really like this feature and feel like it gives the gown some really fun style elements. I then started sewing the lining together, and I made sure to stitch the side and underarm seams at a 1/2 inch seam allowance instead of 5/8 inch like I did for the outer. I realized after I had the whole lining constructed that I had forgotten to apply my facing fabric to the lining, and so I had to pull out a few seams and stitch that in place and then reconstruct a little bit after the fact. It took a little bit more time, but oh well. I was able to then put my lining inside the outer portion of my gown and baste around all of those edges to keep them stable for when I went around with my bias binding. I made sure to keep my basting stitches within the width that I knew my bias binding would be so that I didn't have to go out and pull out all those basting stitches after I got the bias binding sewn on. I stitched my cuff pieces together, interfacing them with spare lining fabric. Since it was a quilting weight cotton, it was thick enough to work as an interfacing, and then I attached my cuffs to my sleeves. This part was a little bit finicky, and I think I could have done it better because the lining wants to kind of poke out from the edges, and the cuff facing also wants to do that a little bit, even though I did understitch it. But I guess I should have made the cuff facing a little bit smaller than I did, And I think next time I would even make the sleeve opening a little bit larger so that I would have the space to add a sleeve facing in there, and I think that that would help prevent the, the sort of peeking out on the edges that I'm getting right now. But we live and learn, and I'm not going to complain too much about it. I had some coverable buttons in my stash, and I decided to use them and some scraps of my velveteen and make some decorative and very coordinating buttons for down the front of my gown. I toyed with the idea of using some sort of frog closures, but in the end, I decided that buttons were probably a little bit easier and more accessible because I would not have to order them or really delve deep into making my own frogs, that is. I stitched my buttonholes onto my gown before adding my bias binding, just because of the ridiculous bulk that it would add under my presser foot, and I didn't want to deal with that and have, skipped stitches or wonky lines or anything. After binding all of the edges, it was finally time to sew my buttons in place. I last minute decided to add one more little detail, and that was a little loop on the back side of the collar flap on my right hand side, and a little button underneath the collar flap on the left hand side. I will show you what that does in the reveal. I really love the way this gown turned out, and even though there are some little things that I would change for next time, such as the lining, being made in a slippery fabric would really be ideal because you can feel it tugging against your pants. as you try to sit down or do certain kinds of movements. But even with that, I love it, and I want to make so many more. I want to make full-length ones, I want to make calf-length ones, I want to make hip-length ones. I am a little obsessed.